Hi, and welcome back to Gardog the Gamorrean Star Wars Miniatures tutorials. In this video, I want to share some of the methods that I use to keep track of various things during a skirmish. There is no set way that you have to do each of these things, and the following are just the ways that I found easiest, but you should do whatever works best for you. Even if you don't use any of the methods I use, they might just give you an idea for something that'll work better for you. The first one is something I mentioned in my 5th video, when we were looking at activations. Every time I activate a character, I turn it to face the opposite direction. By doing this, I can easily see which characters have activated this round and which haven't. If there aren't many characters involved in the skirmish, you may not need to do something like this, but I just find it much easier to track it this way. There are a couple of other options to keep track of activations that I'm aware of. The first of those is rather than having the figure face the other way, you could do the same with the stats card. Just make sure you spin it around with the character's stats still facing upwards, rather than flipping it over so you can still read them. I don't use this method as I always feel that I've got too many other things either on or around the stats cards, that it's just a pain to move them in any way. I guess it just depends on how many characters you have in your squad and how much room you have on the table you are playing on. Another option I've heard of is to place some sort of small marker on the base of the character's figure or stats card as they activate. It works, but once again, it just means something else that you have to make sure that you don't accidentally bump when moving figures around. Personally, I find turning the figures alternatively towards the top and bottom of the map to be the simplest option, but as I said before, you should do whatever you find works the best for you. Moving on, the next question is how do we record the damage that each character has taken, and how many force points a Jedi may have remaining. When I first started playing this game, I purchased what was called a starter set, which, as well as including a map, some tiles, a 20-sided die, rules book, and a number of figures and stats cards, it also included a number of small damage and force counters. I've since bought some more and then laminated them all to help them last, but unfortunately, I wasn't smart enough to do that initially, so you can see that a number of them have significant wear. I use these to show how many hit points or force points a character has remaining. At the start of a skirmish, I will place force counters on a character's stat card to represent the number of force points that character begins with. Then as they use them throughout the skirmish, I will remove a counter. It makes it very easy to see how many they have left at any given time. I do a similar thing with the damage counters to show how many hit points each character has remaining, with one significant difference. I don't initially place any of these damage counters on the stats cards at the start of the skirmish. As I used in an example in one of my videos when making attacks, we saw that there are abilities that only affect wounded enemies, so by not placing any damage counters to start with, makes it very easy to see who hasn't taken any damage yet. Then, as a character takes damage for the first time, I place the counters on their card to show how many hit points they have remaining. Here I have Obi-Wan Kenobi, Jedi Master, who starts with 120 hit points and 5 force points. During setup, I will place a 5 force counter on his stats card, but no damage counters. Sooner or later, Obi-Wan takes damage. Let's say he takes 30 damage, I will place damage counters on his card to show that he has 90 hit points left. By only placing the damage counters onto the stats card once a character has taken damage, it saves me placing any counters on any character that has only 10 hit points, because as soon as they take damage, they are defeated and removed. If you don't have these counters, you could use anything of a suitable size that you can get your hands on, as long as both you and your opponent know exactly what is representing force points and what is for damage. Another way to track damage and force points would be to use a pen and paper, but I feel that there is already enough things clogging up the table, and I have the counters, so I use them. As well as using the counters, I also use a second method when I have more than one of a character that has more than 10 hit points. While I can't have 2 Han Solos or Luke Skywalkers in a single squad, I can have multiple elite stormtroopers or super battle droids. Elite stormtroopers and super battle droids all start with 20 hit points. If I use 2 of these in the same skirmish, and one of them took 10 damage, how do we know which one it was? To cater for this, I've put a small mark of colored paint on the base of the figure, at the back. Obviously, this is a permanent thing, so I would recommend you think carefully before blindly following my lead. I specifically use red, blue, yellow, orange and white paint, and most importantly, in that particular order. Same as with the damage counters, I don't worry about applying the paint mark to the figure of any character that only has 10 hit points, because as soon as they take damage, they are defeated. I have 2 elite stormtroopers. I didn't do anything to the first one, and placed a mark of red paint on the second. Technically, you are meant to have a separate stats card for every single character that is in your squad, but that would mean that if you were having a droid army, you would need many battle droid and super battle droid stats cards, all showing the exact same information, displayed on the table. I think it takes up too much precious space on the table, so I just use the one stats card whenever I use more than one of any character in a squad. If you do use multiple stats cards, but still want to use this paint method, you'll just need to somehow mark the stats card with the appropriate color to match. Once again, this is a permanent thing, so consider your options carefully before proceeding. As a more complicated example, I own 6 super battle droids. I didn't put any paint on the first one, red on the second, blue on the third, and then yellow, orange, and lastly, white. If I'm using all 6 of them in the same skirmish, when the first of them takes damage and I need to place the damage counters on the stats card, I put them in the bottom half of the card, in 2 rows of 3, and because I know my order is no paint, red, blue, yellow, orange, and white, I can easily keep track of who has taken damage. As I mentioned, I don't place any damage counters onto the stats cards at the start of the skirmish, only force counters where applicable, which obviously doesn't include the super battle droids. Let's say that the first 2 rounds are completed without any of them taking damage, so the stats card still has no damage counters on it. Then in the 3rd round, the one with the blue paint mark takes 20 damage, defeating it. The figure with the blue mark is immediately removed from the map, and I place 5 stacks of 2 damage counters on the stats card, skipping the 3rd spot in the top row. Then, later in that same round, if the super battle droid with the yellow paint took 10 damage, I will remove a single damage counter from the first spot on the bottom row. I find this method very easy to follow. You don't have to use the same colors or particular order as me, but you will have to make sure that you always use your same chosen colors, and more importantly, the same order of those colors, every time you play. And I can't stress enough that marking the figures or cards with paint or similar is permanent, so please consider your options carefully before making any changes. If you have characters with special abilities that can open and close doors, and you struggle to remember which are open and closed, I suggest that you quickly create a spreadsheet with the words open, closed, and destroyed written a number of times. Print it out and then cut out each word. If you have access to a laminator, run them through it so they'll last much longer. Depending on exactly how you want to work it, you've got 2 options with these door markers. You could put one on every single door during setup, and then change them every time a character's movement or a special ability changes the status of the door. This may be the best option for any players that struggle with remembering the status of doors. Personally, I don't have issues remembering that a door is open when a character's figure is next to it, but it does get a bit trickier to remember when special abilities alter the normal operation. I prefer to not place any of these door markers on the map to begin with, and even when a character's movement opens or closes a door, I still don't worry about it as I can see that the character is adjacent or not, to know the status of the door. I only use the markers when a character uses a special ability on a door, as it's not obvious when looking at the map. It totally depends on what you and your opponent find the easiest way to keep track of things. Next, in the Star Wars Miniatures game, There are a number of characters with special abilities that apply a bonus or penalty to other characters for a certain period of time. If a special ability only affects a character during the current turn, I don't do anything special, but if the effect of the ability lasts for the remainder of a round, or maybe even for the rest of the skirmish, I definitely find it worthwhile. As an example, let's take a look at the Imperial Knight. They have an ability called Cortosis Gauntlet 19. If, when using their lightsaber block force power against an enemy with a lightsaber, they roll a 19 or 20 for their save, the enemy gets minus 20 damage for the remainder of the skirmish, effectively reducing their damage to 0. Think of this ability as the Imperial Knight permanently extinguishes their opponent's lightsaber. For this, I did exactly the same as what I did for the doors. I printed a couple of small labels saying minus 20 damage and laminated it. I then placed this marker on the enemy's stats card covering their damage, so if that character was to make an attack, when we went to calculate the result needed for the attack roll, we can't miss seeing the minus 20 damage marker. I also made similar markers to help with keeping track of a number of other special abilities and force powers. Some examples are Logray's Force Corruption power, the Treadwell droid's targeting ability, the Hoth Trooper with Atgar Cannon's Fragile 40 ability, the ASN and E522 Assassin droid's Program Target ability, and the Exceptional Jedi Apprentice's Impulsive Jedi Hunter ability. And the last thing I want to mention in this video is if you need to keep track of the number of rounds for some reason. You normally don't, but you and your opponent may agree to play a skirmish for a set number of rounds, or maybe introduce some other effect, like a large squad of reinforcements arriving, after a set number of rounds. If I ever need to keep track of rounds, I simply use a spare 20-sided die, and start with it showing the number 1 facing up. Then as each new round starts, I change it to display the new round number. Thanks for watching. I hope you found some of these tips helpful, and I hope you'll join me for my next video where I'll give you the details of a few useful websites I've used over the years.